Annie stood at the back of the lavish ballroom, heart pounding, her fingers clutched around the handle of her small purse. She had not expected such a crowd. Bright spotlights shone on the gleaming marble floors and the high ceiling. Every guest wore expensive clothing that seemed to sparkle under the grand chandeliers. Waiters in crisp white shirts walked around with trays of champagne flutes. The wedding rehearsal dinner was in full swing, but all Annie could feel was a knot in her stomach. She noticed the stares from the people around her. They whispered behind delicate hands. Some had looks of pity. Others had smug expressions that made her feel even smaller. And there, at the head of a long table covered with fine linens and exotic flowers, sat Stephen Armstrong, her ex-husband. He seemed to fit in with the grandeur. Tailored suit, polished shoes, and that confident smile that once made her heart flutter. Now it set off a pang of regret and a stab of unresolved anger. Next to him sat Vivian Reynolds, his new fiancée, wearing a designer dress that hugged her slender figure, her face calm with the assurance of someone who felt she was the rightful center of attention. Annie watched the pair, her throat growing tight. She wondered why she had come. In one part of her mind, she knew this was a bad idea. The invitation had arrived without warning, catching her off guard. Yet she felt compelled to accept, even if she knew Stephen's intention might not be pure. There was a sudden hush in the room when Stephen rose to speak. Glasses clinked as everyone stopped to pay attention. He welcomed the guests, offered thanks for their support, and then his eyes swept the room. They landed on Annie with a pointed pause. The corners of his mouth twitched into a smirk. This was exactly the look she had feared. It was the look of a man who was about to make a statement he knew would sting. From where she stood, Annie's heart pounded in her chest. She felt as though every muscle in her body was tense to bolt. But she stayed. She watched Stephen give a brief toast, praising Vivian and her family, dropping hints of how far he had come since his humble beginnings. His words dripped with a kind of boastful pride. He did not mention Annie's name directly. Yet she felt exposed, as though a spotlight was shining on her in front of all these people. It felt unsettling, almost like a trap. She had not realized how out of place she would feel until that moment. Annie tried to focus on her breathing. She remembered the day she had driven away from Stephen years ago, her eyes full of tears, thinking she was doing the best thing for both of them. She tried to push away the memories of their arguments, the silent drives home, the painful distance that grew between them after they faced heartbreak of their own. She also recalled how she found peace in a quiet bookstore she later bought and rebuilt from scratch. She had told herself that her life was better now. She had moved on. Yet here she was, swaying on her heels in the corner of the richest crowd she had ever seen, face to face with the ghosts of her past. A hush fell again as Stephen ended his toast. The band, dressed in tailored suits, struck up soft music. People turned back to their conversations, and servers continued to float through the room with small hors d'oeuvres. At that instant, Stephen stepped away from the table and strode across the ballroom, heading straight for Annie. She felt the knot in her stomach tighten. He still held that same air of command, but there was something else in his eyes. Resentment, yes, but also curiosity and even a hint of sorrow. "Annie," he said in a low voice, offering a polite nod. "I'm glad you made it." She forced a small smile. "Thank you for inviting me." Stephen studied her, and for a moment it seemed like he did not know what to say. Perhaps he had planned to pull her into a spotlight and prove that he was the one winning at life. But now that they were standing face to face, there was an awkward tension he could not hide. And he saw that he was not as smug as he appeared from across the room. His jaw was tight, and his eyes flickered as if he was sifting through painful memories. "How have you been?" he asked, his voice quieter. Annie swallowed, confused by his sudden softness. "I've been okay. I run a bookstore now. Small but steady." He nodded. "I heard. You managed to turn it into a success." She shifted her weight, feeling the sting of his words. Did he mean to sound impressed, or was he mocking her? "It's not on the scale of your business empire, of course," she said, voice shaking just a bit. "But it's important to me." "Right," he said, then paused before glancing around at the crowd. "I have some people I need to speak to." Maybe we can talk later." He turned to go, but Annie reached out and touched his arm. "Stephen, why did you invite me?" His gaze shifted as if he, too, was wondering what had made him send her that invitation. He opened his mouth, but no words came. After a moment, he said, "We can talk about that later." He slipped away before she could ask more. Annie stood there, her heart in her throat, feeling half foolish, half determined to hold onto her composure. Around her, the party continued. She knew she should feel hurt or angry, but a small spark of curiosity grew in her heart. There was something in Stephen's eyes that made her wonder if he regretted inviting her for the wrong reasons. Maybe he was unsure of himself, too. Though the rehearsal dinner ended late, Annie could not sleep in her hotel room. She kept replaying the evening in her mind, Stephen's sudden invitation, his perplexing stare, and the tension in his voice. She remembered Vivian's casual glances of superiority, as if Annie was some relic from Stephen's past, not a real threat, but more like an example of who Stephen used to be. Annie felt her pulse quicken at the thought of seeing them marry the next day. She tried to close her eyes and rest, but sleep did not come. Instead, she found herself pacing the small suite. The city lights outside cast shifting shapes on the walls. She recalled the broken dreams she once shared with Stephen, the home they had tried to build together, the trips they never took, and the nights they spent talking about the future. Those memories still carried weight in her heart. With a sigh, she finally slid under the covers, forcing herself to rest. The wedding day arrived under a bright sun and mild weather. Annie dressed in a simple blue gown, having debated whether or not to even appear at the ceremony. Still, she felt an odd need to see the day through. There was a chance this would bring her closure. Maybe seeing Stephen vow himself to another woman would allow her to finally let go of the past. When she arrived at the grand venue, a sprawling estate with manicured gardens and a huge fountain, she felt like she was stepping into a scene from a movie. Rows of white chairs lined a green lawn. Winding vines decorated ivory columns. A large white arch was set up for the couple to stand beneath. People mingled, sipping drinks. Some turned to Annie with curiosity. She forced a polite smile and kept to the edge of the gathering, not wanting to draw attention. A string quartet played gentle music, while ushers guided guests to their seats. Annie hung back, feeling torn. A part of her wanted to sit in the last row, far from everyone else, and slip away the moment the ceremony ended. Another part of her wanted to march up to Stephen and demand answers. Why had he wanted her there? Did he want to flaunt the life he thought she had thrown away, or did he truly want to reconcile somehow? She lingered near a flower display until she heard a small commotion by the estate's entrance. A black limousine had pulled up, and out stepped a stoic Vivian. She wore an elegant, beaded gown that fit her perfectly. Photographers angled for shots, guided by a few of Vivian's family members who blocked certain angles they did not want captured. There was no shortage of money in that family, that was clear. The paparazzi seemed trained to highlight the grand entrance of the bride. Annie felt a wave of emotion, envy, sadness, and even relief that she was not the bride Stephen was about to marry. She remembered their own wedding years ago. It was much smaller, held in the courtyard of a friend's home. They could not afford a grand venue then, and they had gone for something warm and intimate. She had found it beautiful at the time. They had looked into each other's eyes and believed in every promise they made. But over the years, money and ambition changed Stephen. Hardship changed both of them. They had lost something important, something that had once kept them close. Annie felt an ache in her chest. She wondered if Stephen and Vivian's union would end up the same way. Would money and power be enough to keep them happy, or would they find themselves drifting apart too? She moved slowly toward the rows of chairs, finding a seat in the back. The sun shone brightly, highlighting the ornate floral arrangements that surrounded the altar. Guests filled in row by row. Before long, the quartet changed tune, the wedding march began, and everyone stood. Bridesmaids in pale lavender dresses glided down the aisle, followed by Vivian, who walked with a practiced grace, her veil pinned in a neat arrangement. Stephen, looking sharp in his tuxedo, awaited her at the altar. His face was calm, But from where Annie stood, she could see tension in the set of his jaw. The officiant began to speak, welcoming everyone, making short remarks about love and commitment. The hush over the crowd was thick with anticipation. Annie's heart pounded, and she silently willed herself to stay calm. She could do this. She could watch the man she used to love promise his future to someone else. But then, something unexpected happened. Stephen glanced up, and his gaze locked on Annie. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The officiant's voice droned in the background, muffled to Annie's ears. She saw Stephen's eyes flicker with doubt. He shifted his weight, glancing at Vivian, then back at Annie. A hush spread through the crowd when he did not respond to the officiant's prompts. People began to whisper. Vivian's poised expression broke into confusion. Her father, sitting near the front, frowned and leaned forward. The officiant repeated the question. Stephen opened his mouth, but no sound came. An uneasy rustle went through the seats. Vivian's eyes narrowed, and she stretched out her hand, trying to take Stephen's. But he pulled away. A ripple of shock moved through the audience. Finally, he turned to the officiant and said, "I'm sorry. I can't do this." Gasps erupted. There was a stunned silence, broken only by a few squeaks of chairs as people turned to each other in alarm. Stephen turned back to face Vivian, looking genuinely apologetic. "I'm sorry," he repeated, his voice louder, carrying across the hush. "I can't marry you, Vivian." For a moment, no one moved. Then Vivian let out an angry cry and stormed back down the aisle. Her parents shot up from their seats, outraged. Camera shutters clicked furiously. The guests broke into frantic chatter. But Stephen stood still, his eyes searching for Annie. A second later, he stepped away from the arch, away from his best man and everyone else, and strode with purpose toward the back row. Toward her. Annie shot to her feet, her heart hammering against her chest. She was too stunned to move. Stephen reached her, ignoring the wide eyes of everyone present. She saw raw emotion on his face. He slipped his hand into hers and pulled her away from the crowd. Paparazzi followed, but he signaled to security, who quickly stepped in, creating enough confusion for them to escape. Annie barely managed to breathe as Stephen led her through a side door of the estate. They slipped away from the chaos of the wedding guests, fleeing the swirling rumors that would soon flood social media. It felt surreal, like a scene from a dream she could not have imagined. Once they found a quiet corner in the estate's grand hallway, Stephen stopped. He turned to Annie, chest rising and falling with rapid breath, as if he had run a marathon. "I'm sorry," he said, voice shaking. "I know I just caused a scene, but I couldn't go through with it." Annie opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Emotions slammed into her: confusion, relief, worry, guilt. Finally, she managed to say, "Why did you leave her at the altar?" His expression was pained. "Because I realized in that moment that the life I built, it means nothing if I'm still haunted by my past with you. I know it's not fair to Vivian, and I know I should have handled it differently, but I couldn't keep pretending." Annie drew in a shaky breath, tears stinging at the corners of her eyes. "Stephen, you can't just cancel a wedding this big without consequences. Vivian's family will come after you. The press will tear you apart." He gave a sad smile. "They probably will. But I had to do what felt right for once." She searched his gaze. "What do we do now?" He let out a long breath. "Get out of here. I need to think clearly. We need to talk without all these cameras and people around." Annie did not have the energy or will to argue. She felt that it was a bad idea, but she also felt drawn to the chance of clearing the air. She nodded, and they slipped out through a side exit to where Stephen's private car waited. As they drove off, Annie glanced back at the estate, swarming with guests and reporters, Vivian's furious parents, and cameras all aimed at the main doors. For better or worse, Stephen had just turned their lives upside down. They made the trip to a lakeside lodge that Stephen owned, several miles outside the city. The setting was quiet and surrounded by tall pine trees, with the calm waters of a wide lake shimmering under the warm afternoon sun. Annie stepped out of the car, still in her formal dress, and breathed in the scent of fresh pine. She never thought she would be here again. She and Stephen had once talked about buying a lodge retreat when they were still married, but at the time, it was far too expensive. He had obviously gone ahead and purchased it after his rise in wealth. The lodge itself was large, built with sturdy logs and a wide porch that faced the lake. Inside it was cozy and decorated with soft couches, a stone fireplace, and large windows that let in a lot of natural light. Annie felt a pang of wistfulness. She remembered how they dreamed about a place to escape from the stress of the city. Now she was actually standing in that dream, but under strange, painful circumstances. Stephen led her inside, then disappeared briefly to change out of his tuxedo. When he returned, he offered her some comfortable clothes he had on hand, simple jeans and a sweater. They were a bit big, but they felt much better than her formal gown, which she draped over a chair. The two of them settled near the large windows, facing each other across a wooden coffee table. For a moment, they were both quiet, as if neither knew how to begin. "Do you want something to drink?" Stephen finally asked, his voice low. "Water would be nice," Annie replied. She felt dehydrated from the stress of the day. He nodded, left for a moment, then returned with 2 glasses of water. They sipped in silence, the lodge filled only with the quiet hum of the air conditioner and the faint sound of the breeze outside. Annie set her glass down and drew a shaky breath. "This is all so unexpected," she said. "I still can't believe you left her at the altar." Stephen sighed. "I couldn't marry someone when part of me was still caught up in old feelings. I tried to move on. I told myself I was over what happened with us. But something about seeing you at that rehearsal dinner, well, it reminded me of all the things I never dealt with." Annie bit her lip. "So, you invited me just to see if you were truly over me?" He winced. "Partly. I know it sounds cruel. I thought if I saw you there, watched you look at my life now, it would give me some sort of closure. Maybe a sense of proving that I'd won. But it didn't feel like winning. I only felt hollow inside. Then, when you actually showed up, I started to remember why we fell in love in the first place." She brushed a tear from her cheek. "Stephen, we fought so much near the end. We hurt each other. I was sure that leaving was best for both of us." Stephen's eyes were full of regret. "We were going through a lot. We lost the baby. We both changed after that. We were young, and we handled our grief in separate ways. I threw myself into making money, trying to distract myself from the pain. I withdrew," she finished for him. "And it felt like we couldn't talk to each other anymore. It all broke us apart." He nodded. "Yeah, I guess in a way, I tried to replace the hurt with success. I was convinced that if I became wealthy and powerful, I wouldn't feel any more pain. But I do. I still feel it." They sat in heavy silence. Outside the window, the sun lowered behind the trees, painting the sky with pale orange and pink. Eventually, Stephen cleared his throat. "I realize none of this excuses what I did to Vivian. I feel terrible about it. But if I had married her, I would have been lying to both of us. I was already lying to myself." Annie slowly reached out and placed her hand over his. "What do you really want, Stephen?" He closed his eyes, inhaling as though trying to calm the storm inside him. "I want to figure out if there's still a chance for us. I know we both changed over the years, but I can't ignore this pull I feel when you're near." Annie's voice was soft. "I feel it too. But we can't rush. There's a lot of hurt between us, and now we also have a world of trouble waiting outside." Stephen forced a small smile. "I know. Vivian's family will make a mess in the media. My business partners will not be happy, and you'll probably be dragged into it since you were part of the reason I left." She sighed. "I can handle it. I've dealt with setbacks and rumors before. My only concern is whether we can handle it together, without repeating old mistakes." He gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "Let's try. We can start by spending some time here, away from the chaos, and see if we can talk everything through." Annie felt a flicker of hope. She nodded, feeling the weight of the day begin to shift. Yes, this was reckless. But she was ready to face the truth, no matter how scary it might be. Word spread fast. Within hours, social media lit up with the news that Stephen Armstrong had abandoned his bride at the altar. Rumors circulated about an unknown woman from his past. Reporters flooded the gate of the lodge, hoping to snap a photo of Stephen and Annie. Staff members kept them at bay, but the tension was thick. During the following days, Stephen and Annie took quiet walks by the lake, often without speaking much, as though they each needed time to process. At night, they would sit in front of the crackling fireplace and share memories, both the good and the bad. They spoke about the pain of losing their child, how it drove a wedge between them, and how they each coped in unhealthy ways. Stephen admitted that after the divorce, he buried himself in work to feel in control. Annie confessed she had built walls around her heart, afraid to trust again. Somehow, voicing these truths brought them closer. They did not suddenly forget all the anger or sadness of the past, but they began to see each other's wounds and realize that maybe neither had meant to cause the other harm. Meanwhile, Stephen fielded calls from board members, lawyers, and even Vivian's father. There were threats of lawsuits for breach of contract related to partnerships with the Reynolds family. Stephen explained that he would accept full responsibility for the canceled wedding and would compensate for any financial losses. Though it stung, he decided it was worth the risk. He knew his fortune might take a hit, but for the first time in years, he felt he was doing something honest. Annie, for her part, stayed mostly inside or in the secluded woods by the lodge, trying to avoid the press. She worried about her small bookstore, but she was also determined to see this through. Some days, she felt unsure whether she and Stephen could truly reconcile. They would have moments of tension, arguments about the past. But then they would also share tender moments, like remembering a sweet joke from their early days or comforting each other when sadness rolled in. One evening, Annie stood on the porch overlooking the lake. The sun was setting, its orange glow reflecting on the water. A gentle wind rustled the leaves of tall pines. She thought back to the day she signed the divorce papers. She had never felt so alone. It was as if a piece of her had been cut away. Yet, she believed then that she was doing the right thing. Now, she wondered if sometimes the right thing in the moment still hurts the most. Stephen stepped out onto the porch, standing beside her. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said, looking at the mirrored sky in the lake. She nodded, hugging herself against the slight chill of dusk. "It is." He hesitated, then placed a soft hand on her shoulder. She did not pull away. After a silence, he spoke again. "There's something on my mind." She turned to face him, heart thumping. "What is it?" He took a deep breath. "I need you to know that I'm ready to face whatever consequences come from me leaving the wedding. But if we're going to try again, I need to know we both want it." Annie gazed into his eyes. "We can't do this halfway." He nodded. "Exactly. I won't do it halfway again. It nearly destroyed us before." She closed her eyes briefly, remembering the fights, the silent treatments, the tears. Then she opened them, tears brimming once more, though she tried to keep her voice steady. "I want to try. I won't lie and say I'm not scared. But I want to see if we can make a life together again, this time with honesty and understanding." Stephen exhaled in relief, a small tear slipping from his own eye. "Thank you." They wrapped their arms around each other in a tentative embrace. The distant calls of birds along the lakeshore provided the only background music. In that moment, Annie felt a sense of rightness, even if the road ahead looked uncertain. The media storm did not fade quickly, but Stephen had good lawyers and strong connections. He navigated the business side with steady resolve, accepting blame where needed. Vivian was furious at first and threatened to sue for emotional distress. But she and her family eventually quieted down in exchange for a hefty settlement. Stephen signed the papers without complaint, determined to break free of that entanglement. Some business deals collapsed, but others stayed. Over time, the drama in the news started to wane, replaced by fresher scandals. Annie returned to her bookstore, a quieter place that smelled of old pages and coffee. She had missed it, the shelves lined with stories waiting to be discovered by her loyal customers. She was not sure how people in her community would react, but to her surprise, many welcomed her back with open arms. They saw past the tabloids and recognized her as the kind, knowledgeable owner who had once made it her life's mission to match people with the right book. Stephen visited often, browsing the rows of books, sometimes with a grin. He confessed he had never had time for reading during his mad rush to become a billionaire, but now he found it enjoyable. Their conversations grew deeper. They laughed more. They faced misunderstandings and doubts, but each time, they managed to talk it out instead of letting it fester into resentment. It was a different approach than before, and it showed them both that they could grow. After a few months, when the media's attention had mostly moved on, Stephen asked Annie to join him at the lakeside lodge for a weekend away from the city. He wanted to cook dinner for her, a simple meal, he claimed. She teased him that she was not aware he could cook, but he insisted he had taken lessons. That evening, they sat by the fireplace, plates of home-cooked pasta in front of them. Annie smiled at the modest meal, which tasted better than she had expected. Once they were done, Stephen cleared the plates, his mood seeming both nervous and excited. "What's on your mind?" Annie asked, noticing that he kept fiddling with his sleeve. He took a deep breath, then knelt beside her chair. "Annie, the last time I asked for your hand, I was a different person. I was naive. I was driven by things I didn't understand. This time, I want to do it right. I want to build a life with you, based on real love and respect." Annie's breath caught as he pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a simple ring, a single diamond set in a plain band. It was not flashy like the giant gems on Vivian's hands. It was elegant and unassuming, fitting Annie's style and heart. Tears blurred Annie's vision. She could hardly believe this was happening. "Stephen, are you sure?" He nodded, voice trembling with emotion. "Yes. I know we have scars, but I believe we can face them together. Annie, will you marry me again?" She choked back a sob, then managed to smile through her tears. "Yes. Yes, I will." They embraced, and in that moment it felt like the world had fallen away, leaving only the two of them in a place of warmth and truth. The quiet sounds of the flickering flames and the soft rustle of wind outside were the only witnesses to the promise they made. A promise to be stronger, to communicate, and to put love above status or wealth. After a while, they stepped outside, hand in hand, to look at the sky full of stars. The lake reflected the moonlight, and a gentle breeze touched their faces. Stephen draped a blanket around Annie's shoulders, and she leaned into him, feeling his warmth. Their hearts were full of both relief and anticipation for the new path ahead. The next day, they drove back to the city, ready to share the news with close friends and family. This time, there would not be a lavish, showy wedding meant to impress the elite. It would be something smaller, more personal. Just a gathering of loved ones, a celebration of two people who had found their way back to each other after losing themselves in grief and ambition. Despite any remaining rumors or criticism, Stephen and Annie stood firm. In the months that followed, they worked side by side on shared goals. She continued to run her bookstore, and he restructured his businesses to allow more free time for what mattered to him. Relationships, travel, and life experiences he had ignored for years. They learned how to resolve arguments before they grew out of hand. Most of all, they learned how to be honest about their fears and needs. One crisp morning, they held a simple ceremony in a rose garden behind Annie's bookstore. Close friends and a handful of family members stood by as they exchanged vows, tears in their eyes, smiles on their faces. There was no paparazzi, no big headlines, no corporate deals overshadowing the event. It was just them, at peace with each other, sealing their promise in a place that felt like home. At the end of the day, they sat together on a small bench near the back of the garden, watching the soft glow of lanterns in the fading light. Stephen slipped his arm around Annie's shoulders, pulling her close. She rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Thank you for taking another chance on me," he whispered, pressing a gentle kiss to her hair. Annie smiled, tears of happiness shining in her eyes. "Thank you for choosing us this time." They sat there in sweet silence, content in the knowledge that despite the pain and confusion, despite the twists and turns that had shaped their journey, they had found a deeper love. It was not a fairy tale, nor was it perfect. But it was real, anchored by forgiveness and trust. And, in the end, that was enough to guide them into a life of true happiness together.